Hi everyone. This is Chapter 14, Solid and Hazardous Waste. So as I mentioned in the intro video this morning, this is the next continuation of discussing pollution problems that our environment faces. So similarly, the nice thing about pollution is once you've covered it in sort of one field, it's easy to apply to lots of other fields. So we've talked about it in air pollution, and we've talked about it in water pollution. So now we're going to talk about it in the form, again, I call it land pollution, solid and hazardous waste. It's kind of the same thing. In any case, we're going to discuss some of the same challenges that we see. So this idea that pollution not just ends up in our water or it ends up in the air. There's also definite problems with where our waste is ending up, specifically something called municipal solid waste, which is the waste that you and I actually generate. So more so in this case than in other lectures where the responsibility for reducing air pollution and reducing water pollution largely fell to companies and industries and cars and things like that. This one is a little bit more focused on what we as individuals actually produce and contribute. So let's go through this. And again, this is probably going to be a two-part lecture. I'll kind of pass through things as I see fit. I'm hoping to keep both of these at about 10 minutes because I feel like that's kind of a good point for video discussions. So in any case, there's an interesting saying. I like this. So Lynn Landis is the founder and director of of a group called Zero Waste America. And they're a group that is really trying to bring attention to this problem of solid waste. And she had a quote that said, "We're living in a false economy where the price of goods and services does not include the cost of waste and pollution." So this is, I don't remember if we talked about this early on in the semester. There's a term in economics, we call it internalizing externalities. And it's essentially when we price in the cost of something, it's not just the cost of what it costs to produce it, how much I'm paying my workers, how much I am spending on raw materials and those types of things. It is also the cost of what I do with the waste that's left over when I'm finished. What's my cost? What is that cost as far as to the environment, to the pollution that I'm producing? So if we were to sort of internalize all those costs and put them into the price of these goods and services, we would see obviously that the price on a lot of things would go up dramatically. And that sort of was her point, is we're kind of discounting all of that right now. So let's talk about waste and what waste is and what we do with waste. So there's two big categories of waste: industrial waste and something called municipal solid waste. So I'll address industrial waste very briefly, and then we'll talk about it later on. But industrial waste is all of the stuff that comes from manufacturing of things. So if we're making things, industries, big businesses, whether we're building cars or we're building water bottles or whatever we happen to be building, that's referred to as industrial waste. Municipal solid waste is the garbage that we produce in places like our homes, offices, our workplaces, schools. That would count. Not necessarily hospitals, because they do have some hazardous waste materials, but you can think of these types of waste products as the things that would go into like a trash can. So if you're in an office of any kind, or you're at school and you throw something in a trash can or a recycling bin, that's municipal solid waste. That's what we're calling it. So it's different than that industrial waste category that I mentioned before. So we've got some good news and some bad news when it comes to waste generation. If you look at the total amount of municipal solid waste that we are producing per person, the number is actually relatively steady. I shouldn't say per person. I should say overall what we're creating continues to go up, right? It's this red line right here. So this is in millions of tons. So over 250 million tons that we're producing of municipal solid waste. But if you break that down per person, the number has stayed about the same. Again, we're looking at this category of around 4.4, 4.5 million tons per person. Our recycling rates are going up, which is good news. So again, if you look at total recycling, total recycled, and the percent recycled, we're recycling about 35% of recyclable materials. It's not great, but it's improving. And the total amount we're recycling as far as millions of tons continues to increase as well. So again, that's good news, right? So there's kind of a good news, bad news scenario when it comes to solid waste. So we have a waste stream, which a waste stream is all the stuff we're throwing away. And if we actually took that waste stream and we broke it down into categories and we take a look at what's inside the waste stream, you would find that most of what we're throwing away is in the category of paper and paperboard. So we still are throwing that mostly away. Second comes things like yard trimmings, and then plastics and textiles would come in third. I'm sorry, food and yard trimmings comes in second. Textiles and plastics come in third. And then if we look at what we do with our waste, most of it goes to the landfill, about a little over half of it. A little less than a third of it gets recycled. Some gets composted, and some gets incinerated. So these are different ways that we can deal with the things that we're disposing of. So we can throw things out, and again, we'll talk about landfills. We'll talk about a little bit about incineration. Incineration isn't as big in this country as it is in other countries as far as a waste disposal method, but we'll talk about it. And then, of course, we'll talk about recycling too. So let's talk about landfills. So quite a while ago, there was sort of no rules when it came to throwing stuff out. We called them these open dumps. And an open dump was just essentially a hole in the ground somewhere that anyone could go to, and you would just dump your trash into it. So that's why we call them open dumps. We don't do that here anymore. That has since been outlawed for quite some time now, but it's still pretty common in developing countries. And it's actually the most prominent method of disposal is they just pick a place and they throw all their trash there. And a problem with open dumps is that the waste doesn't stay there, right? You have leaching of materials through the bags. They can end up in waterways. There's a whole bunch of places where trash can get blown around by the wind. So open dumps is not something we see. So this would sort of be an open dump here, right? So people just throw their stuff away and they don't really care where it ends up. Another problem with dumps or open dumping is that sometimes waterways become open dumps. So especially in very poor places where, again, we talked about this a little bit with water pollution, your drinking water, your water that you throw sanitary waste in, and the water that you throw your trash in is all the same water source, right? So those rivers eventually end up somewhere. They will empty out into a large body of water like an ocean, and all of that waste gets washed up. And unfortunately, components of that waste, specifically plastic components of that waste, often end up in the wrong place, like this poor seabird who ate quite a lot of plastic, which again filled up its stomach. Can't digest plastic, its stomach gets filled up, and then it can't eat anything else. So we also have a situation where not all the plastic waste is actually washing up onto shores. We know a lot of that plastic that is very light. Okay, apologies. I had a little one who needed something. So anyway, so not all of the plastic is actually getting washed onto shores because plastic is typically less dense and it floats. It can move on ocean currents very easily. So we know that there is a great big huge patch of plastic. It's called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and it's not just plastic, but it's mostly plastic because plastic is light. It was discovered in the late 90s, and there are several plastic debris fields in the oceans, but this one is by far the largest. So what we know is that basically as ocean currents move things around, they pick up some of these waste products that have been dumped off in waterways collect in the ocean and then sort of bring them around to this great big giant patch. And it's huge. We have a patch that's over the size of Texas, so bigger than the state of Texas. That's how large the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is. So it's not just a problem of these open dumps throwing things out, it's also a problem of this waste getting blown into waterways or pulled into waterways when it rains, and all of that eventually again empties out into the ocean. Here in the United States and in most developed countries, we have rules that require us to do what's called a sanitary landfill. And a sanitary landfill is a special landfill because we don't just dump our garbage in a hole and walk away. What we do is we line the hole with plastic layers so that water doesn't get through, and then we throw our garbage in and then cover it with soil. And then we'll put on another layer of garbage and then another layer of soil. And so that way, when it's covered, it makes it more sanitary. So you have fewer problems with bugs and rats. The smell isn't quite so bad. So what it does is it creates sort of a nice way to cover our waste. So we also know that as things decompose, one of the byproducts of decomposing trash is actually methane gas. So methane is something that is produced in large quantities in these sanitary landfills. And so there's a couple different things you can do with the methane. Remember, methane is a greenhouse gas and a potent greenhouse gas. So there's a couple things that we can do with it. Some places will just flare it. Flare it means you burn it on site. So you'll see these little pipes sticking out of the ground and there's a flame coming out of it. That's a flare from a methane from the waste site. Or you can collect it and use it as a fuel source. And so there are some waste companies that are actually doing that. They're collecting the methane, they're using the methane as a fuel to then heat a fuel source, which will spin a turbine and create electricity like we've talked about before. I'm going to skip e-waste right now. I'm going to talk about incineration real quick, and then that's going to be it for this lecture, and then I'll pick up with hazardous waste in the next lecture. So we don't do it much here, but there are some cities that actually use incinerators to burn municipal waste. So there's pros and cons to that. The pro is that you're greatly reducing the volume that the waste takes up. So rather than having a huge truckload full of trash, you can narrow that down into just a small box of ashes. So from a volume standpoint, incineration makes sense. But the downside to incineration is you're producing emissions. You are producing air pollutants. There can be things like dioxins, lead, cadmium, all kinds of different toxic components. So the downside is that incineration creates air pollution. So it's not a great solution to the problem, but if you're short on space, and many countries, especially places in Europe and different parts of Asia, they are short on space. So for them, it makes more sense to burn their trash first to sort of reduce the volume of it because they just don't have a place to put it. So I will cover recycling in the next lecture. So we'll talk a little bit more about the processes of recycling, and I'll probably post a video of a material waste recovery facility because it is kind of neat to watch what they do. So I'll probably post that too for you guys to watch if you're interested.